Hello, hooligans. It's me, DeadGirl, here with yet another weird video. And before we start, I would like to acknowledge that I finally made 100 subscribers. Yes, 100 whole subscribers, which is not a lot, but I am baffled that anyone would want to listen to me talk about my niche interests. So thank you if you are a subscriber. And if you're not, I will be appearing in your bedroom tonight while you're sleeping. In today's video, I will be talking about my favorite local true crime case from Denver, Colorado, and one of my favorite true crime stories from anywhere. This is a story of failed public resources. This is a story of one man betraying his only friend. This is a story of frogging, not to be confused with frotting. This is the story of the Denver Spiderman. I love the name Denver Spiderman. It's a very creepy moniker, especially for the time period, and for the most part, it predates the superhero character. But as a Denver local, when I hear Denver Spiderman, I imagine a superhero costume made out entirely of Patagonia vests and North Face jackets. I'm imagining perhaps you're at your local bar and a web grasps onto your drink. Maybe it's a Cosmopolitan or a Negroni, and it shoots backwards, and the Denver Spiderman replaces it with an IPA and then scolds you for not supporting local breweries. But this is not the story of such a chud. Instead, this is the story of a quiet, odd fellow named Theodore Edward Conies. Theodore was born in Petersburg, Illinois in 1882 on November 10th. Scorpio behavior for a Scorpio king. His father, Thomas, would pass away in 1888 when Theodore was just 6 years old. He would move with his remaining parent, Isabella Elam, to Wisconsin before finally settling in Denver, Colorado in 1907. His mother would pass away in 1911, leaving him an orphan at about 19 years old. Theodore had severe health issues at a very young age and was told by a doctor that it was unlikely he would reach his 18th birthday. As for what was affecting his health, I read about 9 articles on this man for this video and could not find what specific ailment he had. My guess is something like ongoing tuberculosis or reoccurring pneumonia, just based on what were the largest causes of death in the United States during the early 20th century. But I am not a doctor. If anyone knows what disease Theodore had, please comment below. As a child, Theodore was described as dull and frail, and because he was getting treated for his condition for long periods of time, combined with his doctor telling him that he didn't have much time left to live, he dropped out of school at a very young age, barely even starting high school. This kept him isolated from his peers, and he was really unable to develop much of a social life. Even before dropping out of school, Theodore had a hard time making friends. His mother was very protective and restricted his activities, not letting him do sports or play with other children, for fear of breaking his frail little body. But Theodore was not completely without hobbies, and his chosen pastime would lead him to meeting his future victim. You see, Theodore Coney loved playing the mandolin. Music was a safe alternative to sports for the young boy, and he would join the local mandolin club in Denver when he was only around 8 years of age. The club was run by Philip Peters, a friendly man who worked as a railroad auditor. Peters would hold the mandolin club from his own house, 333 5 West Moncrief Place, where he would welcome other mandolin players so that they could practice the instrument together. His home was a cute 2-story house in the West Highland neighborhood in Denver, which is now a really beautiful neighborhood and very close to where I got one of my tattoos, actually. Anyhow, Philip Peters was very friendly to the young Theodore and was probably one of Theo's only friends. They would eventually lose contact, however. Theodore would move out of Denver to try and make a name for himself, and leave behind the mental anguish he felt for the way he was treated by his community. However, the lack of education, combined with his disability, made finding a foothold in any career beyond difficult, if not all-out impossible. Coney promptly became homeless and adapted to a transient lifestyle in order to survive. He would drift between the East Coast and Colorado before ultimately returning to Denver for good in 1941. When Theodore Edward Coneys had first returned to Denver for a visit in 1911, he reconnected with his old friend. Philip Peters was surprised and thrilled to see that the once young boy had lived beyond his estimated expiration date. Typical of his kind nature, Phillips would regularly have Theodore over for dinner. When Theodore came back to Denver in 1941, he had no one to turn to other than Peters, and was in a worse condition than ever. Theodore Coneys saw only one option for himself, and this decision would not only change his life forever, but also the lives of the Peters family. Theodore decided that he would return to Philip Peters' home on Moncrief Place and acquire money and food at any cost. But when he got to the home of his once friend who had treated him with such kindness, he found that the place was empty. He snuck his way in through an unlocked window and searched the house for valuables. But what he found instead was opportunity. Making his way through the house, Coneys found his way up to the attic and saw something that gave him an idea. A tiny crawl space within the attic. The cubby was tiny, only about 27 inches tall and 40 inches wide. But for the man's tiny frame, made even smaller from years of unhoused malnutrition, he had no trouble crawling in and making himself comfortable. Well, as comfortable as you can be in a tiny attic crawl space filled with dust and spiders. Theodore Edward Coneys developed a normal routine. Well, maybe not normal, but normal enough if you are secretly living in someone's house without their knowledge. Theodore memorized Philip Peters' habits and would sneak downstairs to get food when he knew that Peters was asleep or out of the house. I've read from one source that he would even leave the house in case there wasn't enough food in the kitchen to find food elsewhere. This is so wild to me. Coneys noticed that Philip was the only person there. This was because Philip's wife was in the hospital recovering from a hip injury. For the next few weeks, all was going well for Theodore, and he hadn't run into any trouble. According to interviews, Theodore said that he felt like he was playing a game where he would shadow Mr. Peters around the house. He became more daring as to even move around the house while Peters was still at home and awake. On the night of October 17th, 1941, Conies claimed that he heard the 73-year-old man leave the house, and so he jumped into action, slithering out of his dark hole and slinking downstairs to find himself some supper. Unbeknownst to him, however, Mr. Peters had not left his home and was actually upstairs in his bedroom napping when he heard a downstairs agitation. Downstairs agitation? Why did I write that? Pretty sure I get a downstairs agitation anytime I see a Daniel Craig movie. Okay, but anyway, Mr. Peters got up from his bed and made his way to the kitchen. What happened next is a little bit disputed as we do not have Phillips's side of the story. But according to Mr. Conies, Mr. Peters looked terrified at seeing someone in his house digging through his icebox. Theodore stated that he felt threatened and thought that the old man would kill him if he didn't act fast. Theodore bludgeoned Peters with an old pistol that he had found while exploring the house, and then finished the bloody deed with a steel stove shaker. And by this, I think it means a grate platform that goes inside of the stove that you can remove. But regardless, Theodore now stood over the lifeless body of one of the few people who had ever treated him with kindness. In the aftermath, the Peters neighbor came to check on Philip, as he had not made it to dinner at their house, and called the Denver police after discovering the body. The police found no signs of forced entry, as all of the windows and doors to 3335 Moncrief Place were locked. They searched the house but found no one. When later asked about the cubbyhole in the attic, the Denver police office acknowledged that they noticed the hiding place, but did not think to check it as they had doubt that anyone could crawl their way into such a tight place. And for the time being, the murder went down as unsolved. Theodore Conies would spend the winter in the house, even after Phillips's wife moved back in. He would go on to say that the winter was so brutal that he lost feeling in his lower legs and was unable to move from his little spider hole for several days. He spent his days listening to a radio that he had stolen, as well as sitting alone in the darkness with his thoughts. Helen Peters, along with her housekeeper, would often hear strange sounds in the house that frightened them. Mrs. Peters had called upon the police to check up on the noises, but they did not take her seriously. Her housekeeper would eventually quit her job as she was too afraid to be in the house any longer, convinced that it was haunted, likely by the ghost of Helen Peters' late husband. Helen eventually abandoned the house as well, to go live with her son elsewhere in Colorado. The neighbors to the now empty house would see things like lights turning on and off, and shadows behind windows. The neighbors brushed this off as prankster kids playing around in the house. It would be until July 30th, 1942, when the Denver Spiderman was finally discovered. At that point, Theodore Edward Coneys had been living inside the minuscule hidey hole for over 9 months. Okay, but let's think about this for a second. Let's say that you conceive a child on the day that Edward Coneys sneaks into that house, and then you deliver that child in July when he was found out. Other than that child being a Leo, what dark forces might affect that child's life from that being his journey? Something to think about. It's something to think about. But anyway, the Denver police were doing a routine check on the house when they heard the faint click of a lock upstairs. They rushed up into the attic just as Coneys was crawling back into his dark resting place. The cops made it just in time to see his ankles and feet disappear into the crawl space. They pulled him out by his ankles from the trapdoor and were astonished to see how the man had been living for almost a year. The man they saw was covered in filth and looked very gaunt. The newspapers reported that Coneys was only about 80 pounds, despite his almost 6-foot frame. I don't know how true that is. It sounds like you die before getting to that weight ratio, but regardless, he was in really rough shape. Inside the hole, there were empty jars filled with human waste and empty canned food. There were some thread-thin blankets, a small radio, and a little electric toaster he was using to keep himself warm. When asked about the incident from reporters, a police officer said, "A man would have to be a spider to stand it up there long." This, along with both the crawlspace and Coneys himself being covered in spiders, was how the moniker of the sneaky Denver Spiderman was derived. Edward Coneys gave the police a lengthy confession that explained why he killed Peters and how he managed living in that small space for so long. Here is a portion of the confession I found from the Hearts Pounding podcast. "I have no living kin, no money, and no grudge against anyone in particular. I killed Peters because he caught me robbing his icebox. I was looking for money I knew he had hidden in the house, but I did not torture him in an effect to make him show me the hiding place. He would have killed me if I had not finished him. Even though I had changed since the old days, I was afraid he would remember me." When asked why he killed Phillips with such force, more than what would be needed to incapacitate him and get away, he said, "I don't know why I hit so many times. I guess it was just the hatred I had been storing up for years against everyone who had the things I always wanted and never could get." Theodore Edward Coneys was found guilty of first-degree murder at the age of 59 and was given a life sentence without parole in the Colorado State Penitentiary in Canyon City. After the way that Theodore had been living, the prison cell was a big upgrade of life quality for the man, and this would be his first experience of societal welfare, as he would no longer need to worry about food or housing. His reaction to his sentence can be summed up in this quote: "Now I feel safe. I'll have a better home than I've had in years." Coneys died on May 16th, 1967, at the age of 84. His story remains to be one of the creepiest of Colorado true crime. Part of me thinks, and I'm not trying to excuse his crimes at all, because clearly you have to have those violent capabilities inside you to kill a 73-year-old man. But part of me is like, if he wasn't in such a desperate situation, if there were better social safety nets for him to turn to, then it's undeniable that no one had to lose their father or their husband. And that's really sad. And I think that's honestly my biggest takeaway from this story, other than check tiny little holes in your house, because you never know if a dirty little man is in there. Woo! Check your holes. Check your house holes. Mm-hmm. All right. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Kind of my first time doing true crime, and I had a good time doing it. I hope you enjoyed listening to my reading voice. If you liked this video, please make sure to click like and subscribe, as well as comment any suggestions you might have for me. I also have a Patreon in the description of my channel if you're feeling extra generous. Subscribers to my Patreon receive videos early, as well as their names shouted out in the credits of future videos. And with that, I'm DeadGirl. Good night, goodbye, and good luck.